talking about Artaud's notebooks, and I've got a facsimile edition here for you to look at. The paper's loosely divided into three sections. The first considers the status of Artaud's work and the types of signs that it mobilises. The second addresses how the work is reproduced, or how it fails in a very reproductive process. And the third is concerned with the temporality of the notation process. I've chosen to focus finally on the notebooks, as this is the most recent material that I've been researching at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and they are still not widely available in the UK and remain untranslated, so I expect many of you might not be familiar with them already. So at the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari ask, what is the body without organs of a book? Continuing by claiming that there is no difference between what a book talks about and how it is made. Their process of rhizomatic writing emphasises the interbeing of thought and the necessary interbeing of its expression. A rhizome has no beginning and no end, but always a middle from which it grows and overspills, they write. It cannot be reproduced, and it is an A-centred, non-hierarchical, non-signifying system. Antonin Artaud's influence on Deleuze and Guattari's thinking is significant throughout their writing, but I want to turn to a dimension of his work that is often strangely overlooked in their reading of it, in spite of their continued insistence on materiality, and that is the text in its physical, material dimensions. The interbeing of the book might be thought of here as a form of notation, a resistance to completion and to beginning, and more importantly, a resistance to signification, representation, and the work in favour of a powerful, asignifying and gestural force. Overall, I'm interested in exploring what kinds of signs Artaud's work mobilises, signs that he describes in the theatre and its double as effective signs, but also, as we're here to discuss today, affective signs, that is, signs that seek to overcome the problem posed by representation conceived as a distancing or separation of the sign from its referent. In these terms, Artaud was perhaps a product of his times. As many theories of the avant-garde argue, the early 20th century was characterised by a feeling of acute loss in relation to language, a feeling that it had lost its effectiveness following the publication of Saussure's course in general linguistics in 1916, in which the linguistic sign's meaning and its ability to act upon the world had been put into question. In fact, Foucault argues in The Order of Things that this shift from what might be called a performative to a representative conception of language had already occurred in the 17th century during the Reformation. In the 16th century, he writes, real language is an opaque, mysterious thing, closed in upon itself, a fragmented mass, its enigma renewed in every interval, which combines here and there with the forms of the world and becomes interwoven with them. In other words, the linguistic sign still has a direct relationship to the real world. Language resides among the plants, the herbs, the stones, and the animals. He claims that whilst all other forms of language were intent upon taking the world further away from its expression, literature from the 19th century onwards was operating an inverse movement, seeking to reconnect words with the origins of things. He writes, forming a sort of counter-discourse and finding its way back from the representative or signifying function of language to this raw being that had been forgotten since the 16th century. Foucault explicitly refers to Artaud here, alongside Mallarmé, as an example of this inverse movement or counter-discourse. And this is where magic comes in Artaud's work, because magical thinking takes its sign and reference to be one. To say something is to enact it, which is to say that it is inherently performative, like Foucault's pre-Reformation conception of language. Artaud writes, in the introduction to the theatre and its double, if magic is a constant communication between interior and exterior, between acting and thinking, between the thing and the word, between matter and the mind, it is reasonable to conclude that we lost this blistering inspiration, this nervous illumination, a long time ago. Artaud believed his own work to be magical, to have the power to protect him from evil, or to perform acts of cruelty on his behalf, because he conceived his signs as powerful forces, drawing from his readings of the Kabbalah and the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Indeed, the figure of the double that reoccurs through Artaud's work is drawn from the ancient Egyptian Ka, a kind of spirit that accompanies human beings throughout their lives but lives on after their death. Artaud's insistence on Kaka throughout his work can be read as a linguistic play on this figure. The affective body that Artaud creates through his work is performative, in the sense that it is a continual doing, and in the Deleuzean sense perhaps a becoming, emerging from the interaction between matter, gesture and utterance. His signs are intended to act rather than to simply represent an absent reference, and he believes they will become rather than replace what they express. What, one might ask, are the implications of these kinds of signs for the reader? I want to start to answer this question with a quote from Artaud's Pèse-nerfs, one of his early texts published in 1925, where he directly addresses his future reader, providing an approach to understanding the entirety of his work. So he writes, "Dear friends, what you have taken to be my works are only the waste products of myself, these scrapings of the soul that the normal man does not welcome." Here, Artaud, having published just 3 slim collections of scraps of writing, more like pamphlets than books, full of letters, manifestos and aborted poems, is already anticipating the creation of something more substantial that might be named the work, yet is at the same time denying the possibility of naming these strange objects as such. There are 2 types of work implied here, those that are evoked in the term complete works, and then there are what might mistakenly be taken as Artaud's works, which are neither texts without an author, nor works belonging to an author, but physical objects that bear witness to corporeal presence. The activity that Artaud undertakes in the Pèse-nerfs, as the title suggests, being a play on the verb penser, is one of thinking through the nerves, a type of thinking practice that is of the body, painful and material, having physical weight. A pèse in French is a set of scales, and the English translation is the nerve scales. The Pèse-nerfs already suggests that the writings that Artaud produces are simply byproducts, the waste left over from what his real work is, a work that, far from the presence of the body that created it, remains a kind of mystery to the reader. Artaud's impossible works require bodily presence because his entire project moved towards the rearranging of the body and the creation of a new anatomy that Deleuze and Guattari would later appropriate as the body without organs. What might be called the real work remains in this unreadable state as a virtual presence in relation to the surface of the page. As readers, all we are faced with is a series of fragments that Artaud describes as racures. What are these racures? The word in French portrays a sense of filthiness, so to call someone a racure is a nasty insult, a bit like scum in English, something grimy to be scraped off the surface, like what you might find underneath your fingernails or inside your belly button. Artaud engages with scum throughout his writing in his emphasis on bodily fluids, defecation, dirt and parts of the body that are neither inside nor outside, such as the umbilicus, damaged skin, and bodily cavities or folds. This fascination with corporeal waste can be read as an exploration of in-between states, things that are not quite dead, not quite separate from the body, but somehow stick to it, waiting to be scraped off. We might also think of Aristotle's idea that the skin itself is nothing but scum, formed by the drying of the flesh, like the scum on boiled substances. He writes, "It is so formed not only because it is on the outside, but also because what is glutinous, being unable to evaporate, remains on the surface." The waste product of Artaud's self, the fragments, the work, or whatever it might be called as opposed to work, is a kind of scummy, scabby skin, an excretion that sticks to the body and needs to be picked. What I want to address in this paper is how we might conceive of Artaud's thought or thinking as a kind of racure, a substance that is of the body, indeterminate yet material, and relating to surfaces, specifically the surface of the page. It has often been noted, perhaps most eloquently by Susan Sontag, that all of Artaud's projects failed, and that this failure is an inevitable feature of his work, leading him to abandon cinema, theatre, poetry, and any format that might resemble something coherent, or something that the normal man, evoked in this quote from the Pèse-nerfs, might produce. Yet it is less often noted that the one medium he never abandoned was paper itself. When he was in the Rodez psychiatric hospital, he wrote in a letter to Jacques Latremontlière, who was the doctor in charge of administering electroshock treatment, "I have, for a long time, ceased to see anything outside the paper on which I write." This was a desperate attempt to convince Latremontlière that ECT was no longer necessary, but it takes on a much more specific meaning in relation to the work he was producing at the time. Drawings and portraits that drew their figures right up against the surface of the page, covered in holes, rhythmed by dots, cigarette burns, and the grain or the grid of the paper, scribbled through, disrupted. These drawings might be seen as a continuation of the spells that he began to send in the late 1930s, objects that would, in the absence of his own body, perform a physical, protective or destructive purpose, magical objects designed to act, not to represent. The forces put into action in these drawings spill out of the body and onto the surface of the page, and are present in his writing, gesturing, and vocalizations, never reaching completion or becoming a finished form, but always remaining in process, and, I want to suggest, in no form. Many of those who knew Artaud in the last years of his life bear witness to the complex gestures that took place before his pen reached the surface of the page. These gestures materialise as tiny dots and holes, the moment where the pen or knife was stopped mid-flight striking the page. His wild gesturing was not limited to the space of the notebook, and was so violent that Artaud's doctor had to install a stabbing block in his room in Ivry to stop him from destroying the furniture. So this is the top picture is a picture of the head of Artaud's bed, and the bottom is the block that his doctor installed to stop him from stabbing the furniture. And you can see there's some of his work lying on top, where you can see that the stabbing extended well beyond the paper on which he wrote. So this photograph immediately raises the question of how to distinguish between the world, the body, and the work. Should this stabbing block have been preserved alongside Artaud's texts? For Artaud, the moment where the knife drops on the block, or the pen on the paper, is not the end of a gesture, but the mark of its continuation, a sustained and cruel hammering, cruelty being used here in the same sense as his theatre of cruelty, cruel because absolutely necessary. His appearance at the Vieux Colombier Theatre in Paris on the 13th of January 1947, 1 year before his death, was punctuated by erratic hammering. Artaud could not speak without literally hammering his point. Another photograph shows Artaud waiting for a bus at Ivry, and he's stabbing a particular point on his back with a pen. So we can see here that the relationship between the body and the work is immediate and contagious, the surface of the body extending onto all other surfaces around it, engulfing them as if all objects were organs to be destroyed. Elsewhere, Artaud frequently complains of suffering from eczema, but we can see where he scratches and tears on the surface on which he writes, on paper, in the place of his own skin. In the last few years of his life, Artaud filled 406 notebooks. I want to ask what it was that made the notebook such a perfect vehicle for the expression of this strange form of corporeal thought. The notebook bears witness to a particular form of physical presence, being portable, disposable, malleable, and resisting completion and publication. More importantly for Artaud, the notebook is marked by traces of all kinds of bodily gestures that cannot be put into words. To recall Deleuze and Guattari's interest in how a book's content bears witness to its processes of production, Artaud's notebooks serve as a reminder serve as a reminder of the conditions in which he lived, and he writes about these conditions as they materialise on paper. Not only does he write about drugs, but we see his handwriting deteriorate as their effect kicks in. There are no punctuation marks or capital letters, no beginning or end to the writing as Artaud slips in and out of consciousness, and we can actually see the stains from spilt laudanum on the surface of the page. He writes of his lack of money, reminding us that the notebook is the cheapest medium, and the notebooks all have creases down the middle, which you can see in this version, which is where he would fold them in half and shove them in his pocket when he went out, so that they would be instantly available at any given moment. These signs of the material context in which they came into being are as important as the words that describe them. Artaud never allows us to forget that his work comes from a suffering body, confined to psychiatric institutions during the Second World War, undernourished from lack of food, and in pain from a fractured vertebrae, an injury sustained from the convulsions caused by electroshock treatment. So on the first page of this notebook, which I've reproduced here, Artaud describes his creative process in the following terms. So he writes, he decontracts and ceases to pursue an inert object. He surrenders, abandons the idea of his body, but fixes a point more forcefully with a limb or a firm finger. Gesturing in space, contorting the body and fixing this gesture on a specific point on the page, leaving a dot or a series of small holes in the paper, is the closest that Artaud can achieve to an expression of corporeal thought, outside language but nonetheless inseparable from it, appearing alongside a description of the process. This is not the idea of the body, then, but its direct expression. This is not a thought, but the perpetually moving, never-ending thinking process, for which the surface of the page is not the site of form or finitude, but rather a site it traverses and puts into process. Thought is a relation of surfaces, then, to be expressed through the act of scraping and to be read through the scum that is left over. In the absence of his own body, and considering the impossibility of actually carrying out the corporeal transformations that he calls for with the creation of a body without organs, perhaps the only truly organless body for Artaud becomes the material surface of the paper itself, as an extension of the body's largest organ, its skin. Across the pages of this notebook he scrawls the words, and this is another page from the same notebook. He joins his hand and escapes from the domain of thought, of the world, of arrested thought, and he enters into unlimited moving thought. He does not enter into it, he is in it. The notebook for Artaud is a domain of unlimited thought, escaping the word that arrests the thinking process and denying it a discernible form, activating its capacity as a force or a powerful affective sign. Again here, the interbeing of thought is crucial. It's a process that's already begun and inextricably linked to the gesture, evoking a kind of prayer. So I'm now going to turn to the question of how these gestures can be reproduced. Artaud's battle against representation is a battle against completion, but also, as we've seen, a battle against his body being appropriated or stolen, as Derrida argues in his essay La Parole Soufflée. Artaud's worst fear is that his words might become detached from their corporeal origins, stolen from the body that they strive to mould, at the same time as it expels them. Perhaps ironically, then, Artaud's insistence on the bodily origins of his writing and his fear of his text being appropriated by external forces has led to a dispute over the ownership of these notebooks. Shortly before his death, Artaud entrusted his friend Paul Thévenin, who was to become the editor of his complete works, with a suitcase full of notebooks. She managed to transcribe half of this vast collection of often quite illegible text and publish them as volumes of the complete works, but she died in 1993 before she managed to complete the task. She left the notebooks to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, who are currently planning to digitise them, so they'll eventually be available online. In the meantime, however, members of Artaud's family have begun to dispute Devenant's methodology, arguing that she had no legal claim to the notebooks and did not allow the inheritors access to the documents. But the most significant issue is that her supposed transcription of the text of the notebooks is arbitrary, with punctuation added, passages missing, and the layout of the original notebooks completely ignored. The text forms only a minor part of the complex machinations, gestures, and unidentifiable scribblings that take place across the notebook pages, and so the dispute over ownership is in reality a dispute over how Artaud's textual objects should be read. The problem becomes how to reproduce this work without detracting from its distinctly material presence. It's easy to see why Devenant's rendering of the notebook page as text in Artaud's complete works was so heavily criticised. In 2006, Gallimard published this facsimile edition of one of Artaud's notebooks from January 1948, so 2 months before he died. The facsimile attempts to reproduce the notebook in exact detail, including all its physical blemishes, but it somehow fails, becoming a fetishised, limited edition collector's item that betrays the immediate disposable nature of the original object. We can see the damage that the paper has sustained, but we can't feel it. We can see that the paper is cheap and nasty, but it is expensive and shiny. Whilst Artaud's notebooks were the cheapest you could possibly buy at the time, this is probably one of the most expensive notebooks you can buy now. It costs €39. It even comes with a protective cardboard envelope, which is in turn wrapped in cellophane, and comes with a legible version, which is the transcription of all the text within, with an introduction by Evelyn Kosman. So we might be led to question both what we are supposed to do with this expensive, good quality object and how we are supposed to read it. We could replicate Artaud's gestures and stab the pages at the same points, although due to the thickness of the paper, we probably wouldn't get very far. And we could try and bend it along the creases it already bears. Alternatively, and perhaps inevitably, we could add our own marks, traces of our own corporeal presence. But what this object, enveloped in various protective layers of packaging, seems to suggest is that we should keep it in pristine condition, safe from sticky, inky hands and accidental spillages. This notebook lacks a sense of suffering that in the original object is difficult to ignore. The writing bears witness to this as much as the surface of the page does. It is filled with desperate pleas to be left alone by the forces of persecution that hound Artaud. So he writes, and this is another page from the notebook. It is time, it's high time, it's beyond time now for these beings to get away from me and release me. It isn't natural, it isn't normal, it is materially impossible to be in the body of another individual. As a reader, it is materially impossible to inhabit Artaud's suffering body. Does this mean that the body must remain illegible? The notebook page provides an adequate vessel for Artaud's corporeal explorations of the thinking process, precisely because its reproduction always fails. We can never reproduce the holes, creases, stains, and graininess of the original page. Any reproduction reintroduces this difference between the book and how it was made, betraying its origins. I want to turn now to the issue of temporality in these notebooks, thinking alongside another French theorist for whom Artaud's work served as an inspiration, Roland Barthes. References to Artaud's texts occur frequently in Barthes' texts, yet he never dedicated a single text explicitly to Artaud, instead insisting, this is a quote, "The impossibility of talking about Artaud is more or less unique. You can't speak or write about Artaud. The only solution is to write with Artaud." Barthes' most well-known engagement with Artaud's writing comes at the end of The Pleasure of the Text, where he characterises Artaud's text as writing out loud, a writing wallpapered with skin, and a stereophony of profound flesh, the articulation of the body, of langue, not that of sense, of language. He also writes about the temporal problems inherent in Artaud's work, arguing that it is the destruction of discourse not as something that has already happened, which he argues would only produce the blank page, nor is something announced for the future, in which case it would merely reproduce the same structures it denounces, but as a continual process, which, fittingly and in true Artaudian style, he likens to the mastication of one's own excrement. I don't want to talk about any of Barthes's explicit references to Artaud at this point, however. I'm more interested in drawing parallels between the two by looking at their trajectory as writers, with particular emphasis on the movement away from work, in Barthes's case most famously towards text, but then once again away from text to that very same practice that characterises Artaud's final works, notation. Barthes's last text, based on his lecture series at the Collège de France, treats the subject of notation, thus ending his career by considering the very first stages of writing. Artaud's search for a medium that could adequately express bodily experience also led him back to the beginning, in a reversal of what one would normally expect. So he began his career with a series of letters to Jacques Rivière, asking him what he needed to do to render his text publishable, and he ended his career by creating objects that resist publication, simply taking notes. The very last words that Artaud wrote, scrawled onto the pages of his final notebook, most likely written under the influence of chloral hydrate, are written in note form without punctuation. They read etc, etc. These are neither last words nor first words, but the sketch for an elusive oeuvre that is never to be complete, and an acknowledgement of the importance of incompletion, of failure, and of the present tense of writing. Notation always takes place in between the body and the work, having a direct relationship to both. It is a practice that hasn't quite left the body and hasn't quite reached its destination as published work. Appropriately and perhaps inevitably, given the nature of notation as they conceived it, both Artaud and Barthes's experiments in notation were interrupted by their deaths. In the preparation of the novel, Barthes writes about notation as a writing of the present. He writes, it would be false to say that one cannot write the present. One can write the present by noting it down at the same time as it falls upon you or under you. This notion of falling recalls the dropping of the pen onto the surface of the page. In Artaud's practice of notation, a fall that is mediated by the body. If Artaud's writing privileges the present tense, this is because it seeks to resist any conclusion, and with it the passage into an obsolescent past. Yet what forms of temporality are implied in the abbreviation etc, etc? It's not just a reference to what is happening now, but what is about to happen and what has just happened, a process that has already begun but remains incomplete. It implies repetition, a list that is to continue ad infinitum, a process that is nonetheless contained in an ellipsis, a dot dot dot. In French, this is called point de suspension, or suspension marks. Artaud's writing becomes a suspension of the present. Like the notebook, it is the blueprint for an apocalyptic form of expression that has yet to materialise, or to use the expression that reoccurs throughout his work, it's always pas encore, or not yet. Notation, in Artaud's form of it, expresses the thinking process as it is happening, not yet realised into concrete thoughts, but suspended between the body and the page. This is the movement of thought that undoes itself and speaks in a language which has always already failed because it cannot signify, cannot represent, cannot be reproduced, but can only bear witness to the fragility of the surface on which it is inscribed. How do we reach a conclusion when talking about Artaud? The power of Artaud's work, which completely resists this designation as work, lies in the fact that it has not yet occurred, as this is always on the brink of realisation. The most significant contribution that Artaud's form of notation, which extends well beyond the notebook page, can make to a theory of creativity is through putting into question the distinction between the product and the processes through which it comes into being, and it achieves this through its spectacular failure as work, expressed with immediate visceral ferocity. I want to end with an Artaud appears twice. On one side is the idea of the body, false, frail, emaciated and passive, and on the other, a body exploding out of its limits, enacting the spectacular destruction of all organs, accompanied by his unborn daughters of the heart, who are these figures here, most of whom were already dead, marching with brandishing weapons towards the false body, surrounded by notation in glossolalia. So this is halfway between sketch and drawing, traduction and œuvre, a diagram for